So today we'll be talking about arrays. So what are arrays? I'll give a brief definition real quick. Every time I introduce a new concept, I like to give a formal definition, and then we can branch off of that and talk about application, its usage, and how and everything else that comes with it. So the definition of an array is a group of variables referred to as a common name, and arrays allows the user to group a bunch of variables of the same type, uh, and the variables can be either primitives or objects as long as they are of the same type. And what the same type means is, for example, integer is a type, Boolean is a type, or like an object type such as a string. So basically, the picture here demonstrates what an array is. Think of an array as a big container containing indexes, and each index is a separate small container containing an individual variable inside. So in this example, the array has 9 separate variables inside, so its array length is 9, and each of these individual index values contains a value inside. If this definition is not clear yet, hopefully as I go through the lesson, it will begin to make more sense. And if not, you guys can always ask me questions. So I'll move on right now. So the purpose of an array, or in other words, what an array allows us to do, is allows us to do a few separate things. Most importantly, it allows us to associate a number with an index. So instead of creating a different variable name for every single value, it's the same name, and the only thing that changes is the index value. So for example, if we create an array called score with, say, an array length of 10, it would have 10 variables inside, and each of these variables, we would only change the index here. So for example, if we have score 0, score 1, score 2, all the way to score 9, all of those 10 variables would have a different value attached to it. And calling upon the variable with its index is the same as, has the same use as using any other variable, except they all have the common name. And what this association between a value and the index of its container is, it means that we can create and manipulate large numbers of variables with more efficiency than like copy and pasting the same code and creating a variable multiple times because we can't attribute its name to something else. And also allows data to be sorted and searched based on a criteria. For example, sorted based on smallest to largest, or searching for some value within the data. This is a more advanced topic, so don't worry about it if you don't know what a sort or a search is yet. But it's one more reason why we should become familiar with arrays. And lastly, an array allows for more efficient memory allocation because of the same variable name attached to every single variable value. So so does anyone have any questions about what an array does and why we should learn it so far? If there are no questions about that, I can go on how to create an array and how to utilize it. I know some people are joining now, at this point. So I'll just say simply that an array is a group of numbers and a group of variables, and by grouping them allows for us to manipulate and use and change and utilize a group of variables, a large number of variables with ease. So I'll go on to how to create an array. So the general formula or format for defining an array is similar to how you would define any variable. First, you need the variable type, you need the name of your array, and you need to set it to some value, right? But one thing you have to need for an array is you need an value of its array length, and array length in this instance can be an actual number, integer from 1 to like 100 or even more than that, or it can also be a variable that has a number associated with it. So for example, if we create an array length integer and we set it to 10, that would work. So here's the format. I have it here, and I gave an example of an integer array. So the variable type in this instance would be an int, and then for an array, by definition, you would have to have a left bracket and a right bracket. The array name can be anything you want, from like, I don't know, you can name it Bob, or like score, but usually you want the array name to give the user or the reader of the code an idea of what the variable is representing. So for example, if a variable we are creating is score, I guess, like representing student scores, we would call the array a score. And then you would have to repeat the variable type name, which is an integer in this scenario, and you would have to have some array length. You have to define how big the array and how many containers the array contains before you assign any variables to an array. And for my example, I just gave some random number like 10. So what this does is that it creates an array and initializes an array with 10 variables, and the array has the name score. Someone asked, why is there no recording of the classes? The recordings of the classes should be available on both the Google Classroom page, in which I post after every class within like a few hours, or on the Alphademic YouTube website. So you should definitely be able to see the recording of the classes. And if not, you can always join the Zoom call, which is why I had this. So when you create a variable, when you create an integer array, a default value of 0 is assigned to each of the variables if you do not change the value of any of the variables within the array. This is for integer arrays, and similarly for Boolean, default value is false. For double, it's 0.0, and pretty much you can use the same logic for similar primitive types. And when I said that creating an array creates a container with 10 variables, the variables all have the same common name of score, but their index values change. And when referring to each of the individual variables within the array, you would only change the index value, and the character index matches the way a character index is set in a string. It goes from 0 to the array length minus 1. So for example, above, we have an array with 10 variables. So it'll go from 0 to 10 minus 1, 9. And if you count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, there will be 10 variables within the score array that we created. So does anyone have any questions about an array? I don't think arrays by itself are a really complicated topic. However, I'm not really explaining it as well as I could. So please let me know if you are confused about any of this. Maybe other students have a similar question to what you may be wondering right now, and you asking the question could help clarify a confusion. Any questions? Okay. I don't know. I feel like you guys are able to understand this, so that's good. I'll move on. So, what I talked about so far is what we call a one-dimensional array. A one-dimensional array basically contains a number of a linear number of variables, and changing the index would change the variable to which it's associated with. However, there's a thing called there are multiple dimensional arrays, and most commonly you would see besides a 1D array would be a 2D array. And what a 2D array does is that it allows us to associate two index values with a variable. For example, and this is how you would create a 2D array. If we wanted to create a 2D array with position, for example, creating an 8 times 8 chessboard or something like that, we could identify the position of some, I don't know, some chess piece on a board by assigning a variable to a position on the chessboard. And this requires us to use a 2D array because on a chessboard you have an X position and a Y position. So the two index values in a 2D array allows us to accurately represent the location of a variable. And someone asked, can you create a 3D array? Yes, you can create anything up to like a 5D array, but no, you can go beyond that. You can create any dimensional array. That's why it's called a multi-dimensional array. But most of those extending beyond 3D don't have like real life applications because humans do not visualize the four-dimensional world very well. So most commonly, you would just use a 1D array or a 2D array. So does anyone have any questions about that? I just wanted to touch upon the possibility of multi-dimensional arrays because it's very similar to how a 1D array would work, maybe a little more difficult, but if you understand really well how one-dimensional array works, if you see a multi-dimensional array, you should be able to apply the similar knowledge and skill set to utilize it correctly, I guess. And basically how a two-dimensional array would work, for instance, would be that you would create 8 arrays, an array of 8 arrays with 8 variables in it. So each of those 8 arrays would have an array length of 8. I know that sounds kind of confusing, but it's not that hard to visualize it. If you just visualize it as a grid of containers with 8 by 8, an 8 by 8 grid of containers. So does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, so if you guys understand how a 2D array would work, can anyone tell me how many variables this position array that I gave that example would create? just to check for quick understanding, I guess. Okay, a lot of you guys are really answering the question, so I'm not sure if you guys really understand the question or not, or the concept of race, but 64 is the correct answer. Some of you guys gave it to me. So for those of you that don't understand yet, or maybe you guys just don't want to type the answer, whatever the scenario is, if you have any questions, feel free to either ask me or you can always check back to the recording and the slides I'll post on Google Classroom to see if there's anything that you don't understand. Yeah. All right. Since there is a definitive lack of questions, I'll move on. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to touch upon, it's very relevant to arrays, is taking user inputs. It's kind of relevant to taking user inputs because usually when you want to take more than one user input, you would store all of the user inputs into a array, because if you have multiple user inputs, you could just create an array, call it input, and then stuff all the variables inside the array, right? So this is one of the concepts that is very crucial. You'll be using this a lot. However, it's also a very complicated concept. There are multiple ways to take user inputs, and every single way has certain benefits and deficits, I guess. For example, some of the most common ways to take a user input would be a scanner class, a buffer read reader, an input reader, and there's a few more. I haven't used all of them, but the easiest method and the method that you are usually introduced to as a student, especially someone that is new to Java, would be the scanner class. The scanner class is relatively simple and it accomplishes the goal of reading a user input of an integer relatively well. And no, this is not the last class. We still have a few more. Yes, you can use buffer read reader instead of scanner. I just mentioned that. Buffer read reader is probably better, but it's also more complicated. So I do not want to go into buffer read reader for an introductory class. In fact, like I usually use buffer read reader for like competition Java coding. Yeah. So I'll explain how to use a scanner class real quick. It's called a scanner class because it utilizes a built-in Java package. And when you use a Java package outside of its main API, you would have to import it. And I think we talked about the math package before, and this is very similar. The scanner package, you would just type at the very top, even above all of your methods, you would just type import java.util.scanner, and typing this allows us to use all the functions of a scanner and take user inputs relatively simply. And then after importing the Java scanner package, you would have to create a scanner. It says it is a class. You would create it like any other variable. You would have the variable class name, which is scanner, the variable name. Usually you would use input because you're taking the user's input. And then since you're creating a new variable of the class, you would do new scanner. And then system.in is just tells the scanner class that you want to take an input. You do not really need to understand how the scanner class works as of now. It's very similar to how you create any other variable. However, just copying this segment of code allows us to set up the input process, and setting up the input process is really what's important about this line of code. So after You write these 2 lines of code, and you would always write these 2 lines whenever using the scanner class. You can utilize it. And anytime you want to take an input, you could do input.nextInt or something similar like that. Some other things you could do would be input.nextLine, input.next, whatever. You can read strings, integers, whatever. But for the sake of the example I'm giving, and for today's class, we'll be talking about reading integers input by the user to the console. So we would just use the next int command, and it would basically read across your pointer to the point of the next integer. For example, if we have like 2 and then 4, it would first read 2, and then once you do dot next int, it would read 4. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. And once you can treat this as sort of a container holding the value that is inputted by the user, an integer value inputted by the user to the console, and you can set a variable within the program to equal this value. And this allows us to create a variable representing the input, the integer input that a user put into the console or the program. So does anyone have any questions about the scanner class? Also, if you guys know any other input methods, buffered reader, for example, feel free to use those. I am just explaining the most simple user input class, the scanner class, for the purpose of an introductory class. No questions? Okay. I'll demonstrate real quick how this works. Let's see. All right, so we have our program here, right? What I meant by importing the package of a scanner would be, we write at the very top above everything, we write import Java and this would input the Java package for scanners, allowing us to use it further along. And then once we have that, we would just copy the code I said that would set up the input process. And from here on out, you can read user inputs. For example, I don't know, let's see, int variable equals input dot next int. So knowing this, let's see. Maybe you want to create a simple addition calculator or something like that. Maybe just to really quickly test something. I don't know. It doesn't have to be very complicated. Okay, so I wrote a relatively simple program as a demonstration. Hopefully it runs. Ah, shoot. Okay. See, it works. If we input one variable, 3, and we input another variable, 6, our program adds both of the inputs we take and outputs the sum of them. That's a very relatively simple program, but it shows that we can read the user inputs. And to demonstrate that I'm not cheating or anything, I can enter a different set of 2 variables. I don't know, 31. See, look, it adds both of them. 5 plus 34 equals to 39. And what's interesting is that I actually have an error in my slides. The Java has to be lowercase, so I'll fix that real quick. Yeah, so this demonstrates how we can take user inputs relatively simply. So does anyone have any questions about the scanner class and how to take user inputs? Or any questions on my demo? No questions. Great. So now I get to test your understanding, hopefully. So first I'll go a quick review. So last time when I talked about for loops, I said that for loops allow us to fill an array with user inputs. And this would be how we do it. And this is another demonstration of how we can use the scanner class. And by this point, this should make sense to you. And if it doesn't, I'll explain it to you real quick. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. So this is the mandatory statement we have to have for using a scanner class. Here, we take an input. The user determines the length of an array because we need to know the length of the array to create an array. In this case, we call it container with some number of variables within it. And how we use a for loop that's for an array with user inputs is we do for I 0 to I less than array length, I plus plus. This allows us to go through every index of the array container from 0 to array length minus 1 because I is less than array length, and allows us to take the input using the scanner class from the reader, from the user, and put it into the container. So this is how we use a for loop to fill an array with user inputs. And this is why an array and taking user inputs really goes well together, because generally, if you're taking multiple user inputs, you would use an array. So does anyone have any questions about that? That's just a quick review. No questions? All right. So now I'll go on to a problem. On the last few classes, I didn't really have a chance to really go over the problem or demonstrate it very well. So hopefully, since today we have a bit more time, we can treat the problem I'm giving you guys as an accurate assessment of whether you guys learned what an array is or not. So here's the problem. You guys can read it, and I'll read it out loud to you as well. So the problem is we create an array of integers representing the scores of students on a test. It could represent something else, but for the sake of simplicity, we're saying their student scores. And as a result, we allow the user to determine the length of the array length, through a user input. And then we generate random values from 0 to 100 for each element in the array. And the number of elements is determined by the user. And the reason why we're generating random values from 0 to 100 is because they're representing scores, the percentage a student earns on the test, for example. And once we do this, the task is to print every element in the array and the calculated average of all the scores as well. And I'm giving a hint, the average does not necessarily have to be an integer. For example, if 6 students get a sum of 5 points on the test, which is quite awful, right? the average would be 0.83333, which is not an integer. So we have to account for that. So do you guys understand the question, the problem? Actually, let's see. You guys don't have to print every element in the array because it's user. Oh, you have to print every element in the array because it's not user inputted and it's generated by a random value. Okay, so for those of you that want to try it, feel free to start now. Otherwise, I'll demonstrate how I do it. We'll just use REPL. You can use any other program, for example, IntelliJ, Eclipse, BlueJ, but REPL is just simple for me. I don't have to open anything. And this is a relatively simple program, so you don't have to use an object-oriented API. So create an array of integers representing scores of students on a test. Okay, first we know that we have the user input for an array length, so we do the mandatory scanner thing. So we have the lines that allow us to use the scanner. So now we define a variable array length and we allow the user to determine it. Now we know the array length, so we can create an array representing the scores of the students on the test with a length that is determined by the user. So it's pretty simple. You just follow the format of initializing the array. We call the array score because that gives us an idea of what it's representing. Remember that we can use variables to represent how many variables are within an array, so this is fine. So for each value in the array, we have to randomly generate a value from 0 to 100 to fit it, to put into the container of the variable. So we use a for loop, as demonstrated earlier. This should work. Do you need to import the math module? Apparently you did not. I'm not getting any errors for this. So yeah, I think the math module, math package is built in to Java. And the reason why we use 101 here is because math.random generates a value from 0 to less than 1. So multiply that for 101. It would generate a value from 0 to less than 101, which would be 0 to 100. So now we have randomly generated values. So we have to print out. Okay, I'll create another for loop just for the sake of readability. For this new for loop here, we could actually use variable I because the variable I does not work outside of the for loop, but I'll use a different variable for readability and to not mix up my variables. We can create a variable defined as int sum. And every time we just add the value in the array to the sum value. And then to find the output, the average, we just do sum divided by array length. This should work. And I'll test it real quick. See, it works. The five values we generated are 97, 44, 6, 84, and 1, and the average of them is 46.4, which you can probably check with a calculator. So here is the problem, and this is my solution. For those of you that want to try the problem yourselves, feel free to look at my solution, which will be posted on the slides as well as the recording. And this is a simple lesson on arrays and user inputs, and hopefully you guys were able to learn something on that about that. I'm pretty much done for today. Any questions?